Well, good morning. Welcome to the Science of Mind class. I'm Dr. Petra, and what a lovely, lovely opportunity is to be with you, everybody online right now. We're still everybody online through the month of January, and then we'll look forward to having our local folks back in the building. But of course, we love everybody who's out there online, whether you're local or not. So we are carrying on with our Finding the Christ chapter. We're on page 363, and we're in this section called the Indivisible Whole. And I will tell you that it is in this portion of the chapter that I begin to get a little squirrely with Ernest Holmes's language. He's very much in the Christology of the Christ. He uses a lot of, he uses exclusively masculine pronouns of he. And it is a very anthropomorphic representation. It's a very anthropomorphic experience of the divine presence. And and it's an interesting recognition that this is the place where we begin to really maybe shift away from this kind of language in the science of mind, especially in the science of mind as we practice it today, especially with the impact of all of our new science and our deeper understanding of the nature of reality. There are some really amazing passages in this section on indivisible wholeness. The challenge for me is that it's couched in a traditional language. It would be really no different than if we were reading a section in this book on the indivisible wholeness, and Ernest Holmes was talking about Krishna and from the Upanishads, which is equally as brilliant a writing, speaks equally as much about the indivisible wholeness of reality and our place and part in it, and yet uses the same form of a being that we can relate to, and then also the idea that being is available to us, to hold our hand, to comfort us, and we need that. We need to know that there is a presence, not just a principle, and because we experience it. And when we are experiencing our limitation of living in the human form and in the space-time continuum, we actually need to be able to tap into and have that larger reality remind us of who we really are. Sometimes it's hard for us to remind ourselves. And so that sense of the larger reality being very present as a presence is not only palpable, it's corroborated across all spiritual traditions, but that doesn't necessarily mean it is a being that actually has a metaphor, that actually has some sort of a hand for us to hold, right? And so how do we manage this metaphoric language that is saying something real, but doesn't return us to an idea that there's an anthropomorphic something out there or someone out there that is its own being with shape and definition, which makes it then somehow separate. So there's we're on page 363. And this is the last paragraph before we break into Ernest Holmes's poetry. In the new order of thought, we are likely to fall into as great an error as in the old thought, unless we go much deeper than thinking that God is merely principle. God is more than law or principle. God is the infinite spirit, the limitless conscious life of the universe, the one infinite person within whom all people live, the one indivisible whole. So the error of the old thought is that there's this person out there this mysterious, grand, great big giant person out there, right? And that there are no laws and principles, that it is just praying to this person out there that we hope will grant our prayers, right? That's the error of the old thinking. The error of the new thinking is to focus purely on the laws, only on the universal principle, which we do actually have to do. We have to understand that, and not recognizing this indivisible wholeness of this infinite presence. As Ernest Holmes writes in here, the infinite person, which is life itself, which is the animate principle of life itself, the universal spirit that is the impulse of life, and this limitless conscious life of the universe. And so I'm reading this new book called The Mystery of Being, and it's a whole series of articles of all of these experts, both from the scientific realm and from the spiritual realm, from a conference on spirituality, science and non-dual spirituality. It's brilliant, it's fascinating. It's called The Mystery of Being, from a SAND, S-A-N-D conference. So if you're interested, it's mind-blowing. And it is this conversation where this spirituality and science are coming to this awareness, this indivisible wholeness, and getting there from two entirely different places, right? From the scientific point of view, we get very much the understanding of the recognition of this indivisible wholeness as the ground of being, the matrix. And from the spiritual side, we get this experience of livingness, of presence, of the reality, of the warmth and color of consciousness itself, and how it is expressing itself individually as each one of us. And this conversation back and forth is the two sides, right? We over and over and over and over again emphasize in the science of mind love and law, presence and principle. The two make the whole, not just the one or just the other. And one isn't more spiritual, one isn't more primary, one isn't better, one isn't somehow in charge, right? It's this co-arising of principle and presence, of love and law. And what we're trying to get a hold of here in finding the Christ is some way of accessing the experience of presence, the experience of this indivisible wholeness, not only within us, but as the mystery of being, which is the consciousness in which we are embedded. God is the infinite spirit, the limitless conscious life of the universe, the one infinite person within whom all people live, the one indivisible whole. And so and that we're a part of that, right? It's that it permeates everything. It is the living essence that permeates everything. And so then we start to get into this challenge with the language that's being used to get a hold of this. We must not look afar to see the Christ, for he is ever near at hand. He is always within us. You see, the language itself implies that he is a being, which then causes us maybe to think about Jesus, right? And this is where this language can have old connotations and old imagery around it. And so we might, what we want to do for ourselves is to imagine what's the language that allows us to experience this presence, this personalness, this experience of belonging to the life of the universe and being part of that indivisible wholeness. Jesus stands alone as a man who knew himself and was cognizant of his relationship to the perfect whole. In the ecstasy of self-realization, he proclaimed the truth to be working through him. In the ecstasy of self-realization, right? Not in the oh, I finally have contacted the greater reality and I now see that. it's in the ecstasy of self-realization that I am the indivisible whole expressing as an individual, as this unique expression. And that's where then the language of thou comes in. It is the experience of the one, but as not just the principle, but as the presence. So Martin Buber talks about the three faces of God, I, it, and thou. And in the science of mind, we are very comfortable with I, the indwelling presence, the I that I am, and we're really comfortable with it, which is the principle. The thou piece is something that we want to explore and embrace because it is about this larger mystery, the unknowable and yet experienceable presence without falling into dualism, without falling into the sense of separation. And that is a spiritually maturing engagement. That is a spiritually maturing, what shall we say, practice or spiritual work that we do to embrace this idea of the palpable aliveness and the presence of life, and that it has a teleology, it has a direction, which is more life, which is for life. It's not just this random chaotic thing that's going on. It actually has a teleology, and that it has given all of itself to us because it has become us. It has given everything that it is. It has become the very presence that we are, and it is seeking to express you as us in the unique form and fashion that we do. So this next piece of poetry, right? The first piece of poetry is inner light, inner presence, inner love, inner truth, inner joy, right? Which is a recognition of the I that I am, the indwelling presence. But now this next piece that he writes is thou art the center and circumference of my life. And this thou is this infinite presence without anthropomorphizing it into a super being. It is beingness itself, life itself, the universal spirit and impulse of this consciousness that is evolving physicality into its own greatest expression for, as we said earlier, its own greatest delight. Jesus spent much of his time communing with his own soul, for it is through our inner thought that we contact God, through our inner thought that we contact the universal, not by transcending this life or this world, but by going deeply within to the truth of our being and experiencing that withinness is the same as that which is without us, that which is outside of us begins to give us access to that infinite reality. Out of the silence of his own soul came a direct revelation of his sonship or his childship, shall we say, his oneness with God. And so it is as we do this process, as we do this work going deep within, I think we talked about that last week, that we tap into this universal experience. Now, in the top of page 367, right, in the middle of that first paragraph, call it conscience, intuition, or what we will, it is there. No one need go unguided through life, for all are divine at the center, and all are images of the Most High. Right? And so this is where we recognize that it is in this within that we are opening the doors and channels to the universal. That we are recognizing that there's no cutoff between the individual and the universal. Emerson says there's no bar or window between the soul and the oversoul. It's a continuum. It's one continuum. And that as we go within, we can follow it out into the infinite. And we can, like through visioning, experience the guidance and the direction. So, yeah, so you can see then that in the next piece of the next poetry, that we are now again back into the I am. I am. Because thou art, I am. Do you see, it's this constant working with these faces of the divine, the I and the thou, and the paradox of the oneness, this indivisible wholeness, which is really no different than the paradox that we're constantly exploring now that we have the traditional classical physics and we have quantum physics. And it's as if they're two entirely different worlds with two entirely different sets of laws and mathematical equations that describe them, and yet somehow between the two of them reality is created, as if these two separate worlds, these seem separate because they function so differently, and yet it requires both of them and both sets of understandings for us to actually begin to describe reality. Do you see, it's no different than the I and thou, two seemingly separate experiences of the divine, which are in fact this indivisible wholeness, which is why in our Declaration of Principles it says we believe that the highest God and the innermost God is one God. And that's the paradox, and our spiritual maturing is the ability to see that, to shift between them, to recognize which we want to which aspect of that we want to be in engagement with in any particular moment. Sometimes when we are in the co-creative process, we're being the I that I am and we're being directive. And other times when we're in the flow or we're in crisis, we are being receptive and we're looking for that hand and that intuition and that guidance and that experience that there is actually something larger out there, the mystery of being, that does in fact have a good trajectory, which is for life, where it actually is seeking to evolve all of creation to a greater and greater and greater expression of life, of love and joy and peace, and all of the qualities that we assume or experience as valuable and good in life. So all of this is, so we really, the challenge is that we have to find our own metaphors for this. We have to find our own engagement with all of this. For some people it's nature. For other people it might be other avatars or other gurus or other ways of engaging, right? It could be the mother or the goddess. It could be out of the Eastern traditions or the indigenous traditions. And all of them are metaphors, right? And I think we talked about it a few weeks ago in the mystics, the Christian mystics, especially the women, the Christian mystic women from the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. They talked about the marriage, being the bride of Christ, the marriage, the union of love, all seeking to kind of find a metaphoric way of speaking about this indivisible wholeness, about the recognition that the two become one, or the two are in fact one. It is the burgeoning awakening of that awareness of oneness, and then all the concomitant paradoxes that come out of that. And so this is on page 369. This is actually one of one of my favorite one of this. Be still, of his poetry in here. Be still, O soul, and know. Look unto the one and be illumined. Rejoice and be glad, for thy spirit lights the way. Lift up thine eyes and behold him, for he is fair to look upon. Listen for his voice, for he will tell thee of marvelous things. Right? And so as I'm reading these things, I'm thinking of him as life, not as a spirit, not as a being. And to really begin shifting out of our anthropomorphized idea of a being into beingness. And then we can see that tarries with us, that thou mayest not be lonely. Take counsel from him, for he is wise. Learn from him, for he knows. Be still in his presence and rejoice in his love evermore. And again, the challenge is his, the language his, first of all, because it assumes that it's male, but more importantly, that it assumes that in the context of that language, that it's a pronoun, right? And a pronoun instantly assumes that it's talking about a being, right? And so the challenge we have is that we have received all of this from the Latin and Germanic languages that all have male, female, and neuter pronouns, and we're kind of stuck with that. In English, we don't have that, right? Which is actually one of the beauties of the English language, is that we don't have masculine and feminine pronouns. We don't say the sun is male and the moon is female, which is we get from the Romance languages. In German, it's actually the reversed. The moon is actually male. So you can even see that there's no consistency of it, because they don't actually have gender. They don't have, right? It's something that over time, as these languages develop, there was this, some sense of some pronouns are masculine, some are feminine, or nouns. So we get into this whole language thing. So it's really challenging. The last piece of all of this that I think is really important for us to recognize is that for some of us, the spiritual journey is very intellectual, right? The Hindus call this Jnana Yoga, and we want to understand, and we want to be able to deeply contemplate reality, right? For other people, the spiritual path or the spiritual journey is actually very devotional. And this is where we see a sense of experiencing the hand that we hold and experiencing the arms of the divine. And often there is a need to provide a metaphorical shape to that. And so that in the Hindu tradition is called Bhakti Yoga. For other people, there's a deep need for that experience of oneness. It's called Raja Yoga. It's through meditation and spiritual practice. And for other people, it's all about the connection to humanity and being in service to humanity and to the planet. And we call that, and the Hindus call that Karma Yoga. It is the practice of being in service, and it is actually being in service to others that we express our oneness and experience our oneness. So we all do this a little bit differently, and we all have a different, some of us, let's see, how do I want to say this? Usually we don't have just one path, but we have a primary way in which we engage with our spiritual journey, and then these other ways are secondary. And so this work with the Christ consciousness works probably the best for people who are on the Bhakti Yoga path, which is they tend to be devotional. And that sense of personhood of the mystery of being is really valuable. So what we don't want to do is make it good or bad. It's not right or wrong. It's not, oh my gosh, I can't believe that you use the words him and Christ, and oh, I can't believe you don't. Right? It's a recognition that we all are operating in our various ways of being on this spiritual trajectory, and to help be informed by the way other people are experiencing this, and seeing if it doesn't illuminate or expand something. So this whole experience of thou, for all of us, is that place when we are not sure and we are not able necessarily to be directive or to stand there and do a spiritual mind treatment and say this and this and this. Sometimes we fall to our knees and we say, "Dear God, help me." And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That doesn't mean all of a sudden we've forgotten and we've lost ourselves in a sense of separation. It is a recognition that we are not all of that, and that there is something larger that we could access through our openness and our receptivity and our intuition. All right, so we're going to stop there, and we're going to see what you guys think about all of this, and where you are with it, and how you feel about it, or how you might be taking it up. So Ryan, we're going to go ahead and turn to you and see what's going on out there. Good morning.
Well, good morning to you, Dr. Petra, and I want to let everybody know, because we've been having a lot of well-wishers reaching out, the incredible and iconic Richard is back with us today. If you haven't noticed, all these zoom in and zoom out. And look, we got a different set, so we're not in an 80s theme, you know. I called it this morning. I said it was a Stanley Kubrick Space Odyssey type of theme that we had last week. Very minimalistic. So, yes, thank you for panning out, Richard. I spent all morning working on that. Anyway, so, yeah, now we would like to hear from you. This is an engaging conversation, and we love to hear from everybody who's joining us. We are online, obviously, as Dr. Petra mentioned before, but we have folks who are here with us inside of the Zoom room, so good morning to all of you. And good morning to all of us who are watching on Facebook Live. So, once again, if you're joining us in the Zoom room, you can always hit the raise your hand icon, which I see we have somebody. And or you can put your questions and comments inside of the chat, and I can bring those into the room. And the same goes true for those who are watching us on Facebook Live. Put your comments in the chat, and I'll bring those into the room as well. And I always want to mention I keep those chats anonymous, just so that way we can continue to provide a safe container for our spiritual uncovery. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and call Shauna into the room first. Shauna, you want to unmute yourself and say hello?
Good morning, Shauna.
Good morning, Dr. Petra. I just want to say thank you. This is one of the most illuminating, inclusive, affirming descriptions I've heard of the totality of the spiritual journey for all human beings. And it was really quite beautiful to me. And if we all could look at the spiritual journey with this level of inclusiveness and belonging and accepting, we would solve a lot of problems on our earth.
Yes, beautiful. Thank you, Shauna. And I hear how much it touched you, and I really, really appreciate you sharing. Is there something that you would like to share about why that so deeply touches you?
I think that because, I was raised in a much more spiritual religious tradition, and I never felt like it was big enough for me or explained enough to me. And so my journey, took me beyond the boundaries or limits of that practice. But there was much that I have taken with me in my spiritual journey as I have expanded my own understanding. And there's much of that I still treasure and value because it was part of my journey and part of who I was and still is part of who I am. And yet, my journey has expanded to a place where I feel my authentic self. And I know where I am and what my spiritual life means to me. I don't always have the words to explain that it's the end and a both.
Yes.
And you gave me words today for that.
Beautiful.
And I just appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shauna. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, the point isn't, right, to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The point is to see, to reimagine, to take up that which is valuable, which from our childhood, from our adolescence, from our young adulthood. I mean, all of that is, in fact, part of our spiritual journey. And to value those pieces that are still valuable to us and maybe reframe them a little bit differently But it's not about making anything or anyone wrong. It is about seeing it in a larger context. And so, yeah, thanks. I really appreciate that. All right, Ryan.
Yeah, can Anita unmute yourself and join the conversation?
Good morning, Anita.
Hey, good morning, Dr. Peter. So, yeah, I do appreciate this breakdown of the different paths, right? And for me, having been raised Quaker, and a particular passage that you read about listening to that still small voice. So, from childhood, that's how I was raised. Is
Wow.
You sit and you listen, right? And so obviously, my journey has been a very devotional journey.
Yes.
But yet, to break it down further, and to give context to that place of service, right? And the path of service being a secondary path for me is why I'm a practitioner.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So thank you for delineating those pathways this morning, because then it just helps me to connect just exactly the pathways that I'm on.
Beautiful.
So, appreciate it.
Thank you, Anita. That is so great. And I see both of those things in you, which is also really great, right? Because the paths that you self-identify are so clearly being expressed in the way that you show up in the world, which is awesome, right? And sometimes I think then what happens is that if we aren't familiar with all of this, then when somebody else's path looks different than ours, we're like, well, why would you think that? Or that's not the way it is. But it is actually the way it is for you, right? And we can be so much more compassionate and so much more inclusive when we recognize our own path, the way in which we engage with it, and see that other people might be taking it up differently. And something about that is also useful to us. It can help us explore things that maybe aren't native to our way of thinking about the world or engaging with the world, but to really be okay that this is the way that I engage with the spiritual path. And I love that you said that, and I see it so clearly, and how profoundly you are walking the path that is native to your being, and it's really beautiful. Thanks, Anita, for sharing that. Ryan.
All right. So can I ask JL to go ahead and unmute yourself and join the conversation?
Good morning, JL.
Good morning. Can you guys hear me okay?
We can.
Great. This teaching has been really beneficial for me in so many ways. I came from a background where I had to be right, and you had to be wrong for me to be right.
Yeah.
And a lot of my family still has that understanding that if this is the truth, then what you have is not.
Right.
So this has allowed me to be more compassionate and understanding of them where they are.
Yeah.
And that's been a gift to me, because I went from phases of being just angry.
Sure.
That you had to make me wrong. And then I went through the phase of, okay, well, let me show you you're wrong, I'm right. And then I'm now at a place where, okay, so it is.
Yes. Beautiful. Oh, JL, I so honor your journey, and thank you for sharing that. I know that those are hard places, and certainly have had my own experience with that in my own life, with my family. And I think that you have articulated beautifully that the either or position. I'm mad at you for making me wrong. Now I'm going to make you wrong, right? Those are both either or positions. And as we mature spiritually and we grow a larger context, there is this place of compassion, not out of arrogance, I'm going to be compassionate that you're ignorant. That's still sort of the either or position. but a deep compassion that says, no, I'm going to allow you to be who you are in my own mind and heart. Not like, oh, I'm graciously allowing you to be who you are, but I'm going to give space in my own mind and heart for the path that you're on, and that I'm okay with my path. And what a beautiful recognition of that. And thank you for sharing that. And I know from my own experience, and I know from your journey, how hard won that place of equanimity is. And so I really want to acknowledge that. And how powerful it is to be able to be confident in our own spiritual path, and recognizing that the truth is so large that just because someone believes something differently, that doesn't what damage or undermine the truth that we ourselves believe. And we can be certain about that, just as others can be certain about the way in which they understand truth. So thank you so much for sharing that. That's really beautiful. Thank you. Ryan.
Yeah, people's hands keep popping up and down.
I love it.
And
go. Let's
all
go.
right. So Armando, I'm going to go ahead and just ask you to unmute yourself. Do you want to share with us what's on your mind?
Good morning, Armando. Thanks everybody for popping up and sharing. I love it.
Well, and good morning, Dr. Petra. I think what resonates right now is identifying the oneness of being of service. That is truly where I am today.
Yes.
And I think these last 5 years or 6 years, been working towards that and really owning that part of my life now, that I am truly being of service, and how connected I am with co-creating with Spirit. And knowing that I am a voice for the voiceless, that I get the opportunity to be out in the world and lend my voice for those that are voiceless and making a difference in the world.
Yes.
And one of the things I've been experiencing is learning to be comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yes.
And that is something that I'm taking up this year. There's so many sacred yeses that I've been saying yes to, even though I don't know what I'm getting myself into. But I know and I believe that, I am one with Spirit, and that I can continue being uncomfortable.
Beautiful.
Challenge.
Yes,
Challenge.
it is.
And I think during the break, during the holiday break, we were closed for the last 2 weeks, and it gave me an opportunity to take my visions I've had and hold it in consciousness, and I was able to put everything on paper. And what was so fascinating is that, or the honest, is that I was able to share with my team my goals for this year, my vision for this year. And what's so fascinating is how the external world has already said yes, without them knowing what my vision is for 2022. And it's just so powerful, and to be able to co-create and know that regardless of what's going on with the pandemic, regardless of what's going on in the world, I can continue to still create and make a difference in the world. And I just keep saying yes, and I just hang on to that, and knowing that I'm just truly connected.
Yeah.
And so thank you for reminding me about being of service, because that's truly who I am now. And I own it now, and I get it. And this is my purpose in my life here, is to be of service.
Beautiful. And it is so evident, Armando, and it's so beautiful. And it's so beautiful as we sink into the way in which we express this indivisible wholeness, the more authentic our lives become, right? And we stop trying to be like everybody else, or we stop, as JL so beautifully said, we stop trying to make people wrong or ourselves right, right? And your authenticity, like Anita and JL, it's all, it pours out. It's evident as we do this work, and we recognize how we ourselves as individuals are expressing this co-creative experience that we're having in the grand scheme of things. And so thank you for sharing that, Armando. It's really beautiful. And what's so lovely is that then we can really honor each other's paths, and we don't have to on the one hand, make somebody else wrong so that we feel okay, and we don't have to worry about, well, why are we not of service? Or why aren't we meditating more? Or why aren't we thinking about spiritual things more? Or why aren't we, more devotional with the divine and have this experience, right? Because we're all uniquely different. These are sort of the primary paths, but the truth is we all kind of have some amalgamation. Just like, you know about brain thinking styles or the Myers-Briggs or any of those things. We're not just one thing. We have a primary, we have a secondary, and the others are maybe things that we can learn about or learn from. And so to really sink into that, and then we recognize we need all of us. We need some people sitting on the mountaintop doing the meditation and the consciousness work. We need our quote-unquote theologians, our philosophers who are thinking about these things and delving into it more and more deeply and expanding our minds and hearts around what's possible. We need our devotional people who help us to remember that it's not just the principle of the thing, but it is the experience of the profound belonging. And I have, even though I don't walk the devotional path, I have felt the arms of the divine, and I've felt myself lifted by the universal presence when I have most needed it. And to remember that, that some of us are so motivated with service that it is the doingness in the world, and that it's not just about being, it is in the doingness of being in service that we are being all of ourselves. And how lovely it is to just rejoice in all of this. And every one of them is an aspect of this indivisible whole. And it takes all of us. It takes some people out and doing service, and people in that devotional experience opening that door for us. And as I said, our philosophers and our meditators, it takes all of that, all of this to express and to further life through us for humanity as a whole and for our beloved planet. So I just really, really love that. We're going to close this chapter with this last little bit called the Triumphant Christ. The Christ knows his individuality is indestructible, that he is an eternal being living forever in the bosom of the Father. Again, right, we're using the old Christology, the old Christian language. But this idea that individuality is indestructible, that we are eternal beings living forever as part of this oneness. The Christ triumphs over death and the grave, breaking through the tomb of human limitation into the dawn of eternal expansion. Right? The triumphant Christ, which recognizes that we are so much more than this limited human experience. The Christ rises from the ashes of human hopes, pointing the way to a greater realization of life. The Christ is always triumphant, is ever a victor, is never defeated, needs no champion. The Christ places his hand in the outstretched hand of the universe and walks unafraid through life. Right? The Christ as us, our spiritual recognition of our oneness, we place our hand in the hand of the universe and walk through life unafraid. We are never left without the witness of the eternal in our greatest moments, in those flash-like visions of mystic grandeur. We know that we are made of eternal stuff, fashioned after a divine pattern. And this is the truth that we begin to know. And so I just want to close on this idea of the triumphant Christ. What you may not realize is that for the early Christian community, the idea of the Christ nature just didn't exist. It wasn't really until Christianity really began to further itself through the councils in the 300s and 400s CE, where they began defining all of these things in the Trinity and all of that sort of stuff, that sort of this whole idea of the Christ actually became something. But what it became was the idea of the triumphant Christ. And so if you look at the religious art from the time period from about 300 to about 1400 CE, that whole span of about 1,000 years, the 90% of the representations of Jesus was of the triumphant Christ. And if you saw Jesus on the cross, you saw him in his robes with his crown, holding a scepter and a staff. This is the representation of the triumphant Christ, of the Christ consciousness that has triumphed over death, which is the representation of the awakening of our experience or our recognition of the eternality and the immortality of our own individuality as a way that the whole is now expressing itself individualized. For 1,000 years, it was the triumphant Christ. I'm sorry to say that it was in the 1400s in a German church by a German sculptor that the first representation of the Jesus hanging on the cross, bleeding from the crown of thorns and from the side, was created. In the 1400s, it was the first representation of that, in that place of the bleeding human experience of the suffering of the cross. And over that 1,000 years, where the triumphant Christ was the iconic representation, right? This whole theology of sin and salvation and redemption grew. It grew and it grew and it grew and it grew. It's not in the original work of Jesus. It's not in the original early Christian church. That grew until it became the primary story. And it is out of that primary story, that shift in the primary story, that then the imagery, the icons that were created to represent the primary story shifted from the triumphant Christ to the Christ of the crucifixion, to the sacrifice, to the need for salvation and the redemption. And it began to focus on the death as opposed to the resurrection. For 1,000 years, the focus was on the resurrection, the triumphant Christ, not because one person triumphed over death, but because it is a representation, it is the myth, the legend, the story of our soul's truth. The truth that we are eternal, deathless, changeless, immortal beings because we are the infinite making itself known and experiencing itself as individuals. This leads us directly into next week's chapter. We'll begin the chapter on immortality, which is, of course, exactly where we should be as we look at the triumphant Christ. Thank you for everyone joining me. Thank you for the sharing. I love it. The more of you that share or make comments or ask questions through the chat, the more we love it. So next week, we'll be starting a new chapter on immortality. Go ahead and read ahead. People have asked me what book we're using. This is the leather-bound Science of Mind edition. It's the definitive edition. Look for the 1938 edition of the Science of Mind with the Gene Houston foreword. And you can get it in paperback, hardback, or leather-bound. Of course, the paperback is the cheapest. But look for the Gene Houston preface, 1938 edition, the definitive edition. It has some extra added things in it. That's the one we're using. This one just happens to be the leather-bound version, the leather-bound example of that. So we'll look forward to seeing you in our celebration here in a few minutes. And we'll look forward to seeing you along the way this week. And we'll see you next week in the Science of Mind class. Have a beautiful week. Bye for now.